Welcome to the beginning of the fourth season of Tuesdays with Merton. My name is Teresa Sandock. I'm a Servite sister and a member of the Tuesdays with Merton committee, along with Daniel Horan and Sophronia Scott, and with the assistance of Ellen Kolb. Tuesdays with Merton is co-sponsored by the International Thomas Merton Society and the Center for the Study of Spirituality at St. Mary's College. The webinars are aired on the second Tuesday of each month. Please note that we are recording this webinar. It will be available on YouTube and as a podcast soon after the live event. You may have noticed that Sophronia Scott is new to our committee. She is a member of the ITMS board and author of the award-winning book, The Seeker and the Monk, Everyday Conversations with Thomas Merton. I would like to invite her now to offer the opening prayer. Sophronia?
The prayer for this evening, I have culled from New Seeds of Contemplation. For those curious, I'm reading from pages 44 to 45. Justify my soul, O God, but also from your fountains fill my will with fire. Untie my hands and deliver my heart from sloth. Set me free from the laziness that goes about disguised as activity when activity is not required of me, and from the cowardice that does what is not demanded in order to escape sacrifice. But give me the strength that waits upon you in silence and peace. Give me humility in which alone is rest, and deliver me from pride, which is the heaviest of burdens. And possess my whole heart and soul with the simplicity of love. Occupy my whole life with the one thought and the one desire of love, that I may love not for the sake of merit, not for the sake of perfection, not for the sake of virtue, not for the sake of sanctity, but for you alone. For there is only one thing that can satisfy love and reward, and that is you alone. Amen.
Thank you, Sophronia. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Mark Meade. Mark is now in his 20th year as Assistant Director of the Thomas Merton Center at Bellarmine College in Louisville, Kentucky, where the bulk of Merton's archives are housed. He has served as President of the International Thomas Merton Society and has presented and published on Merton in the United States and abroad on topics such as Merton's correspondence with Victoria Ocampo, Merton and the existentialist themes, and Merton and Albert Camus on opposition to the death penalty. Here now is Mark Meade speaking on The Seven-Story Mountain at 75, Classic or Déclassé. Mark?
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Sophronia, for getting us started with such a beautiful quote from New Seeds of Contemplation. Thank you both, and Alan and Dan, for the invitation to speak tonight. And thank you, Julia, for filling in for Dan on tech. And thanks to everyone who's joining us. To begin, I'll see if I can get Charles Dickens spinning in his grave with the hokey paraphrase of A Tale of Two Cities, with a substitute reference to the seven-story mountain, which kind of sums up where I was in the preparation of this. It was the best of books. It was the worst of books. It was a book of wisdom. It was a book of foolishness. In short, the book and Merton's struggles were so far like our own present struggles that some of the noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. So put yourself in my position. Over 20 years at the Thomas Merton Center at Bellarmine University, thousands of visitors, countless tours, the perpetual question. Where do I begin with Thomas Merton? What book should I read first? Is there an analogous situation with another writer? Either the best-selling book or the most famous book will be exactly the book required for that person, or maybe the only book that that person really needs to read, or may send the reader in completely the opposite direction, running away. I'm curious in the discussion afterward if anyone wants to bring into the chat other situations where the bestseller itself is a liability to that author. I really struggled to think of other similar situations. In fact, just last week, a post on the ITMS Facebook page, the International Thomas Merton Society's Facebook page, was a revealing insight into how many self-affiliating Merton fans would answer the question of where to begin with Merton. Someone asked for someone who's never read Merton, what should they read first? And though the responses in this format are an unscientific representation, admittedly a group that are composed of people who have read and continue to enjoy Merton, I think the results are revealing. The issue of whether to begin with Seven Storey Mountain was debated, and some had strong opinions. And only a day after the post was launched, it elicited around 100 responses and a couple thousand views. The Seven Storey Mountain was the clear frontrunner as the book, or among the books, one should begin with, according to those who responded, garnering 40 recommendations. New Seeds of Contemplation, I'm glad Sophronia brought a little quote from that to us. That was the second most requested book that someone should start with 15 to 19 responses, depending on how you count it, because some people enter Seeds or Seeds of Contemplation, and sometimes that can be a shorthand for New Seeds. Sometimes people really do mean the earlier editions. Some people just use it as a shorthand. There were 16 other books floated as well, and books about Merton by over 8 different biographers of Merton. In contrast to the 40 recommendations for Seven Storey Mountain, I counted 4 people who very actively discouraged beginning with it. And in my years of hearing people rant and rave about Merton, this seems to be maybe even a higher percentage of in favor of Seven Storey Mountain than against. But again, it's on a page of people who didn't run screaming in the other direction when they encountered Seven Storey Mountain, who are not turned off by Merton. These are people who may have read this and stayed with it, or liked him despite the book. And there are many reasons why people reference not wanting to recommend the Seven Storey Mountain, or at least to begin with Seven Storey Mountain. It's too long. It didn't resonate with them. It didn't connect. I didn't like the Merton presented in Seven Storey Mountain. For those with a negative impression of Merton, and many negative impressions were formed by Seven Storey Mountain, they're not going to sign up for this kind of Facebook page. But varied opinions of the Seven Storey Mountain are not just evident among the casual readers, and I was glad to see a couple of names here that I'm going to reference on our roll of participants. Take, for instance, 2 eminent Merton scholars speaking at the last general meeting of the International Thomas Merton Society, and their contrasting accounts of an encounter with Seven Storey Mountain. Christine Beauchamp used the Seven Storey Mountain throughout her career of teaching college courses on Merton as a modern example of spiritual autobiography. Her gifts as a professor and writer imbue nuance into the study of the text. She didn't view it as an example of a singular shift of religious affiliation, but emblematic of a lifelong process of ongoing conversion. For Merton, this was supported by his monastic vow of conversion of life, conversatio morum. She feels she meets Merton again and again through the fresh insights of each generation of students. In contrast, Bonnie Thurston first discovered Merton by reading the Seven Storey Mountain, but, quote, didn't like it. She found him in his autobiography as a young man to be, quote, pompous, priggish, and prejudiced. Thankfully for subsequent generations of Merton scholars who have relied upon her important work, she discovered the later Merton and would go on to write about Merton's interfaith dialogue, relations with communities of women religious, prayer, and too many other subjects to mention here. In her speech as president at the 3rd meeting of the ITMS, she makes a distinction between Merton, the personality, and the importance of his ideas. She puts it this way, quote, I'm not very interested in the phenomenon that was Thomas Merton. Father Lewis, the individual. In the long run, I think that the man and his biography will prove to be less important than the legacy of his ideas. Another way to say this is to say that Thomas Merton is less important than that to which he points. Like the proverbial finger pointing at the moon is more important than the finger. I think to survive for any prolonged length of time as an archivist of the Thomas Merton Center, and maybe Paul would have a different opinion on this, but I think I've had to be interested in both Merton the person and Merton the writer. Maybe those who find inspiration in the pages of the 7th Story Mountain have to do so as well. I hope at least my appreciation of Merton the person is a warts and all type of perspective, and there are days that the warts make up the primary part of his visage. Like many, I find some hope and solace that someone capable of writing with such beauty on the spiritual life also had such struggles, made mistakes, and as Christine Boshin described, was on a lifelong journey of ongoing conversion. But at this point, I should place my cards on the table. I am mostly sticking to the topic as outlined by the title of the talk. Is the 7th Story Mountain a classic? However, the description of the talk implies that I'll spend most of my time sorting through a historical discussion of the changes that have occurred between the 1940s and now to change our appraisal of the book. I will address this briefly. My goal is not to force an examination of the text through a particular ideological lens, but instead to treat it as literature itself. I was inspired in my first total rereading of 7th Story Mountain in over 20 years. I've used it on probably a weekly basis for bits and pieces, or use bits of it for research on other projects, but I did a full read through and was struck again by what Merton admired about Mark Van Doren, who along with Dan Walsh were among his favorite professors at Columbia University. But one reason he admired Van Doren was that he treated literature, quote, not as history, not as sociology, not as economics, not as a series of case histories and psychoanalysis, but mirabile dictu, as literature. Listening to recorded lectures of Merton teaching the novices at Gethsemane, it's clear that Merton's teaching style was a Socratic type method, possibly based on what he liked about Van Doren's style, which, as he described, quote, adduced excellent things you did not know you knew, unquote, making his classes true education from the root of the word. So in any case, our fundamental question of whether the 7th Story Mountain is a classic is somewhat at odds with a discussion of history, in that a true classic is timeless, even when it recalls the spirit of a past time with seeming accuracy. There is at least broad appeal over generations, even if no classic can reach any sense of universal appeal. And as we have shown in the informal Facebook poll, sometimes that appeal is contentious, definitely not universal in the case of 7th Story Mountain. I argue that the autobiography of Merton's youth is classic, but not for everyone. It's not a classic because it captured the prevailing spirit of the time, like Tom Wolfe's The Bonfire of the Vanities did for the 80s. 7th Story Mountain is a rejection of the predominant cultural dynamic of Merton's young adulthood, an acceptance of a new vision of the world through faith. A decade and a half later, he wrote, quote, my conversion to Christ is something I have always regarded as a radical liberation from the delusions and obsessions of modern man and his society. The only true liberty is in the service of that which is beyond all limits, beyond all definitions, beyond all human appreciation, that which is all, he capitalizes all, and which therefore is no limited or individual thing. The all is no thing, for if it were to be a single thing separated from all other things, it would not be all. In Christian terms, this is to live in Christ and by the Spirit of Christ. The mark of a classic in its endurance is not coextensive with whether it captures the zeitgeist of its time or subsequent eras, yet it seemingly should respond to its time, even if it endures, respond to our time. Merton was sensitive in the 1940s to the violence of the noise of urban life, and through media like radio, noise that could follow a modern American into any remote corner of the country. Though as stated, I will not and cannot dwell on the full scope of all the societal, historical, cultural, and technological changes that separate 2023 from 1948. I think you might think just about our modern media landscape and the technology in the form of a smartphone that can deliver a nonstop barrage of noise via sound, image, and messages anywhere. You could argue that as time progresses, the seven-story mountain becomes less relevant because the world has changed so much. However, Merton's rejection of the violence of noise, his poetic praise of silence, and retreat into solitude and prayer seem needed more than ever, and could be argued to be more relevant now than when he wrote his autobiography. As Merton articulated later in life, as he did in the preface to the Japanese edition to the Seven-Story Mountain, the quote I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, Merton would see his monastic life as a form of protest. The preface to the Japanese edition was written 15 years after the publication of the Seven-Story Mountain in 1963. You can find the preface in Honorable Reader Reflections on My Work. And in Robert Daggie's introduction, he states it was Merton's first reflection on the book, that is Seven-Story Mountain, and the passing of time from the writing of the book. You'll find other brief thoughts on his autobiography scattered through letters and journals, but this is significant in its sole focus on his autobiography and the insights that he lifts up. So for those looking for an alternative to the trends in our culture, trends pushing us to polarization, addiction to technology, noise, and distraction, Merton's path in the Seven-Story Mountain charts an alternative course. However, Merton's spiritual path at the beginning was limited, and his method of engagement with the world would change. The Merton of the Seven-Story Mountain left the capital W world and made space for himself to criticize it for the sake of self-preservation. He states in the preface of the Japanese edition, quote, "When I wrote this book, the fact uppermost in my mind was that I had seceded from the world of my time in all clarity and with total freedom. The break and the secession were, to me, matters of the greatest importance. Hence, the somewhat negative tone of so many parts of, the somewhat negative tone of so many parts of this book." As you'll recall, even in Merton's first paragraph of the Seven-Story Mountain, he refers to the world on the brink of the First World War as a picture of hell. Later, while at Columbia and taking a course titled Contemporary Civilization, he uses a class trip to the Bellevue morgue to sum up his early view of society at his time. He writes, quote, "I had seen rows and rows of ice boxes containing the blue, swollen corpses of drowned men, along with all the other human refuge of the big, evil city. The dead that had been picked up in the streets, ruined by raw alcohol. The dead that had been found starved and frozen, lying where they had tried to sleep in a pile of old newspapers. The pauper, dead from Randall's Island, the dope fiend dead, the murdered dead, the run over, the suicides, the dead Negroes and Chinese, the dead of venereal disease, the dead from unknown causes, the killed by gangsters. They would all be shipped for burial up the East River in a barge to one of those islands where they also burned garbage." Despite the seriousness, I do have to chuckle when sometimes a bookseller tries to lump Merton in with more warm and fuzzy modern spirituality. Despite a fundamental change in Merton's reaction to the world, the late Merton is still the Merton of Seeds of Destruction and Raids on the Unspeakable. Maybe it's no surprise that Fulton Sheen compared the Seven-Story Mountain to a 20th century form of the Confessions of St. Augustine. Merton's pessimism about humanity's tendency to fall into evil has an Augustinian spirit to it. So it's not only in the writing of a spiritual autobiography in which there's a connection to the Confessions. Merton's Augustinian view of the world is colored by his own history of youthful misbehavior, as he accounts for us in Seven-Story Mountain. It's also related to knowing very well the Europe before the Second World War, witnessing Hitler's rise to power, and studying what we learned after the Holocaust and the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I recommend to everyone who has not heard Pat O'Connell's Tuesdays with Merton on Merton and St. Augustine to look it up. It was recorded in April of this year. And also don't be dissuaded by my focus on the darker side of sin and fallenness in Augustine. Pat lifts up some of the more positive outlooks that Merton had on it as well as some of Merton's criticisms of Augustine. It's interesting to note the many other Catholic spiritual traditions that had effects on Merton beyond his Cistercian tradition, rooted in a Benedictine tradition. But there's also a notable omission that I'll get to in a second. Dan Horan has written a book on Merton's Franciscan heart. Merton was influenced by Carmelite spirituality, and another great Tuesdays with Merton is Mary Froelich on Merton and St. John of the Cross from last March. Though Merton was in contact with many Jesuits, Ignatian spirituality did not have a significant influence on Merton. And with the inspiration that St. Augustine had on Calvinists, it's interesting to think that the Jesuits were often pitted against them in their relative outlooks on human nature during the Counter-Reformation, with Calvinists taking the more skeptical Augustinian attitude. I will recall this affinity with Merton and Protestant thought in a minute. Taking the optimistic view of human nature of Jesuits into the 20th century, we're confronted with Teilhard de Chardin. I find it interesting that there seems to be plenty of crossover interest in Merton and Teilhard, when Merton himself had many reservations about him and his writings. This is also an interesting topic right now because of the recent effort by another Jesuit, Pope Francis, to rehabilitate him after the 1962 Monotum warning about the orthodoxy of some of his writings. Teilhard's view of human development, progressing and evolving toward a Christ-aligned future alongside science, seemed to Merton too naive about our ability to take the fruits of our reason and pervert them toward exploitation and injustice. Though Teilhard's view was theologically rooted, Merton saw in it the seeds of the same blindness he attributed to those who eschewed God for faith and scientific progress. A positivist outlook, unconcerned that humans need moral reasoning rooted in spiritual traditions. A tool is just a tool, and technology can be used for good and for evil. But Merton realized just putting the faith in the tool itself without a wise hand guiding it. Merton had done his own study of Teilhard, but it was another Jesuit, Daniel Berrigan, who brought Teilhard into a discussion between Catholic and Protestant peacemakers at the Spiritual Roots of Protest retreat at Gethsemane in 1964. In Gordon Oyer's book about the retreat, he transcribes a recording of Merton relating events of the retreat to the novices afterwards. Relating to Berrigan, Merton says to the novices, quote, "And of course, Dan was talking about Teilhard de Chardin sort of ideas, and they finally got pulled apart. I mean, Teilhard does not cut enough ice with these people. They are Protestants, see. Teilhard does not cut ice with Protestants because all this business about there's going to be a wonderful new civilization, and it's all going to be ducky, and it's going to be the New Jerusalem and all that sort of stuff. Protestants don't buy that at all," Merton claimed, drawing laughter from his charges. "What they buy is the Lord died on the cross, and we've got to hang on to the cross and fight our way through the thing. And I think," Merton added, chuckling himself, "it's a somewhat more realistic view of things." So this sideline about Teilhard may seem a diversion from a discussion of the seven-story mountain. However, I think it's important to distinguish the way Merton's viewpoint on the world and on society at large, which pervades the whole autobiography, does not necessarily change much in his later years. It's more about how he reacts to this fallen world. Does he embrace a Rod Dreher type of Benedict option, withdraw and disengage? Maybe the Merton of the Seven-Story Mountain had more of that kind of outlook. A more mature Merton dwelt apart from the noise of the world while keeping vital lifelines of friendship with people outside the monastery. He knew enough of the news of the world, but knew when to take time for prayer and silence. And out of that silence, prayer, and contemplation, he could model a better way of engagement with the world, responding in love and invitation to embrace a different way. Referring again to the time since the publication of the autobiography, he writes in the Japanese preface, quote, "Since that time, I have learned, I believe, to look back into that world with greater compassion, seeing those in it not as alien to myself, not a peculiar and deluded strangers, but as identified with myself." Here we see Merton echoing some of the same language that he used describing his epiphany at 4th and Walnut in Louisville. which occurred a decade after Seven Storey Mountain's publication and just 5 years before this Japanese preface. Perhaps silence and simplicity are even more foreign to the culture of today than the 1940s, but new generations are realizing the need to find alternatives to the all-consuming noise and distraction of contemporary media, digital culture, and social media. This is why Merton still appeals to many people and has appealed across a broad spectrum of folks of different backgrounds and experiences. When I talk about Merton's critique of noise and mention modern technology, I do so myself as a guilty bystander. Here I am speaking to you through Zoom. I have referenced social media before in this talk, and I will do so again. I am the first among sinners, but my hope is that my studies of Merton have made me a little bit more of a critical consumer of digital media, and I hope he has that effect on new generations coming to him. What makes Merton's story of his youthful seeking in the Seven Storey Mountain compelling to some and not to others on a more personal level? Sometimes it's the tone he takes in his writing. If you will indulge another recent anecdote from the ITMS Facebook page, I think it speaks to the seed of genius within the pages of the Seven Storey Mountain, right alongside an immaturity that is sometimes difficult to overcome. Two different readers were struck by different parts of the same paragraph. The first, writing from Latin America, highlights Merton's praise of his native Spanish. Describing the period when Merton visited Cuba in Easter of 1940, on a Sunday, leaving one mass and going to yet another, Merton writes, quote, "I would listen to the harmonious sermons of the Spanish priests, the very grammar of which was full of dignity and mysticism and courtesy. After Latin, it seems to me that there is no language so fitted for prayer and for talk about God as Spanish. For it is a language at once strong and supple. It has its sharpness, it has the quality of steel in it, which gives it the accuracy that true mysticism needs. And yet it is soft too, and gentle and pliant, which devotion needs. And it is courteous and suppliant and courtly, and it lends itself surprisingly little to sentimentality." Well, this is all very beautiful. And we're just about to get to a very moving part of Merton's trip at the shrine of Our Lady of Cobre and Merton's poetic reflection on it. Yet, the paragraph's not over, unfortunately. It's not surprising that it was a woman on the Facebook comments who remembered that Merton had ended that paragraph about the Spanish language with some words in reference to women. Merton continues, quote, "It," that is Spanish, "has some of the intellectuality of French, but not the coldness that intellectuality gets in French. And it never overflows into the feminine melodies of Italian. Spanish is never a weak language, never sloppy, even on the lips of a woman." Let me repeat that last line. Spanish is never a weak language, never sloppy, even on the lips of a woman. Whew. I do not want to get too wrapped in identity. I can hold that the commenter from Latin America saw also misogyny present in the text, but just wanted to lift up the praise of his mother tongue. The woman who knew full well of the young Merton's ugly and immature statement about women is also a member of the ITMS page and continues to enjoy his writings. She knew that Merton continued a lifelong process of conversion. Yet we all come to the story from a different perspective, with relative pluses and minuses that such comments have to one or another reader. However, the existence of some sections that, to steal from Bonnie's speech, were just plain priggish, still make it difficult to recommend Seven Storey Mountain without a healthy dose of supplemental material in primary or secondary source, so the reader understands that Merton's journey continues to a deeper maturity. I find certain contemporary appeals to identity politics quite reductive. The line of argument that, what can an old, dead, white, straight man have to say to someone who doesn't check all those boxes? Believe me, ladies and gentlemen, dead is the only box I have left to check on this list. But despite the Seven Storey Mountain's detractors, fans of the book certainly also nice comment by Bonnie in the comments. Despite Seven Storey Mountain's detractors, fans of the book certainly run the gamut. From the aforementioned Fulton Sheen and more recently Robert Barron to Matthew Fox, from the high society of Clare Boothe Luce to Eldridge Cleaver writing the Black Power classic Soul on Ice while imprisoned. The story has a relationship which goes beyond Catholic and even Christian circles, those from diverse demographics identifying with the story to speak to something universal in the way that Merton presents his life story. So what are some of the points of connection that people find? And not everybody's going to relate to these, but these are just some of the things that came to mind in my rereading. I think primarily the struggle of a young person to make sense of the world as an adult is a key experience relatable to many readers, and much of the story is about how faith fits into that dynamic in the narrative. Those who've experienced conversion can especially relate. As a cradle Catholic and going through some years of difficulty in accepting my tradition as a young adult, as presented, at least the faith that was presented to me as a child, or that I could understand as a child, it was more of a process of reversion for me, but that was a definite point of connection that I found in Merton's story. The shedding of an immature faith and coming to understand a faith in maturity. However, what Merton's going through is bigger than just a faith journey. There's an intellectual coming of age and trying to make sense of the world. As we discussed with Merton, he certainly saw the world in its brokenness. What do we accept from our upbringing and what do we reject? First, we have the acceptance of the way things are as they are presented to us as children. However, Merton was often the outsider. It was easy for him to see beyond the veil of falsity and the veneer of mere respectability. Seeing life from various cultural perspectives, an American sensibility, French, British perspective, helped him realize what was merely social convention. It can lead to the artist or the intellectual's rejection of the bourgeois in culture and even conventional religious faith at the time. This is often expressed in an adolescent or young adult rebellion. And as we see in Merton getting gated twice at Cambridge, kind of a grounding for college-age adults, and then being sent down, expelled, there was that adolescent rebellion coming out. Just as some of us do not move beyond a childlike acceptance of cultural convention, not all move beyond the adolescent rebellion either. In Merton's brief flirtation with communism at Columbia University, we see him come to a more realization, a more adult realization, moving beyond just adolescent revolt. In Merton's brief flirtation, we can see this more adult critical perspective in his reflection that sees through the externally opposed systems of communism and capitalism and finds them both lacking in their appeal to materialism. He writes, quote, "The chief weakness of communism is that it is itself only another breed of the same materialism, which is the source and root of all the evils which it so clearly sees. And it is evidently nothing but another product of the breakdown of the capitalist system. Indeed, it seems to be pieced together out of the ruins of the same ideology that once went into the vast amorphous intellectual structure underlying capitalism in the 19th century." So here we see the seed is already planted in what Merton will later write in his letter to Pablo Antonio Quadra concerning giants. He contrasts in his later essay, US capitalism and Soviet communism as giants at war, each trying to project its own destructive materialism upon Latin America. Merton's later personalism elevated this analysis with an encouragement for the people of Latin America to chart their own course by their own rich cultural lights, avoiding the dehumanizing temptation wielded by each giant. Another point of connection readers may find appealing about the first conversions recounted in Merton's autobiography and his life of ongoing conversion was the multivalent methods he discovered faith. He recalled the ruins of Cistercian monasteries in his youth in southern France, and while in Rome, it was Byzantine sacred art and architecture rather than the art of pagan Rome that truly attracted him before he could articulate even a religious faith. I mentioned the need to escape the noise and distraction of the modern world. His intellectual conversion was helped by the discovery of Etienne Gilson's writings on medieval and scholastic philosophy. The poetry of William Blake and Gerard Manley Hopkins revealed to him a mystical mode of religious expression that suited his own writing style much more than scholasticism. Merton describes the contrast between the noise and nonstop business of Manhattan and the serenity people gathered for silent prayer at Corpus Christi Parish, where he was later baptized. It is likely more relatable that a whole network of conversion events take place in a person's life rather than a single hand of God moment. And Merton captures the many strands of this process that led to his conversion to the seven-story mountain. He articulates it so well. Apart from ideas and experiences is the notion of personal connections and meaningful friendships. It's not just community for its own sake. The fraternity did not add much to Merton's college experience at Columbia University, not any experience that really endured. Quality friendships like Lax, Rice, Freed, Good, Gibney, and others allowed Merton to share and filter his experiences mentioned through the thinking and questioning they were doing of the art, the poetry that they were encountering, the writing that they were trying to do. Not like the friends he had at Cambridge. They were friends who encouraged his writing and intellectual interests as well as his explorations into faith, sometimes pushing back. As what was later published as a letter to a young activist, Merton wrote that is, quote, "The reality of personal relationships that saves everything." Certainly friends like Lax set Merton on the path he would later follow. When Lax questions Merton what he wants to be, Merton responds, "A good Catholic." But Lax retorted, "What you should say is that you want to be a saint." The last of the appealing aspects in Seven-Story Mountain that I think a lot of people those who do connect with Seven-Story Mountain connect with, applies as well to Merton's other autobiographical writings, such as his journals. It's a sense that many readers have of being able to identify themselves with his story. And this is not a universal reaction, especially to the Seven-Story Mountain, which accounts for the love-hate relationship with it. Yet for those who connect with the story, in his preface to the Japanese edition, Merton references this phenomena of the story taking on a life of itself. And I think he does for two reasons. First, the story is now a creation outside of himself, separated by 15 years. There's a connection he cannot deny, but in a sense in which it's locked in time and belongs to an earlier self who does not exist anymore. Secondly, Merton grants you the freedom to make the story your own, not because of his particular genius, but because just as the Holy Spirit moved in his young life to bring him to the monastery, the Spirit can use this story to animate millions of other stories in lives of readers. It's brought countless vocations to the priesthood, religious life, and with, especially in Merton's later books, encouraged lay people that they could be contemplatives as well. For me, is the Seven-Story Mountain a classic? Yes, because it endures and still resonates with so many readers, including myself. Is it the book I would recommend to you to begin with? I don't know. Who are you? In counseling his novices to be attentive to the individual needs of each person, Merton once told his novices, and this is captured in a recording, quote, "You don't feed sauerkraut to people from the Andes." I will end with Merton's encouragement to us to take what is fruitful in his story and to make it part of our own searching, a searching that continues even as the story, as he states in the autobiography, continues as the story ends, as he states in the autobiography's final words. Merton ends the Japanese preface to the Seven-Story Mountain with these words that I will leave you with tonight. Therefore, most honorable reader, it's not as an author that I would speak to you, not as a storyteller, not as a philosopher, not as a friend only. I seek to speak to you in some way as your own self. Who can tell what this may mean? I myself do not know. But if you listen, things will be said that are perhaps not written in this book. And this will be due not to me, but to one who lives and speaks in both. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing those thoughts with us. What you say about Seven-Story Mountain in some ways resonates with my own experience. A love-hate relationship, and I taught a upper-level Merton seminar for quite a few years at my university, and always hesitated whether I would include it and ask students to do it first or not. So you make me relive those days. You said a number of things I'd like just to pursue. Can you tell me a bit and tell us a bit about how the bestseller can also be a liability? I'm interested in your take on what is the liability, whether in your eyes or Merton.
Well, from the point of view of someone at an archival collection that specializes in Thomas Merton, I have an interest in promoting the author and his works. I mean, also we like to promote a critical response to Merton as well, but you don't want somebody's first encounter to turn them off, to leave a bad taste in their mouth, and that they won't give him a chance or return to him. So it really does depend on the person. Some people started with Seven Storey Mountain and loved it. Some people don't like much else Merton has written. It's so specific, and that I feel is it's maybe it's not unique to Merton, but I don't think of too many other situations where the best-selling book is not the first one you want to recommend to somebody. And yet Seven Storey Mountain is I think very important and tells a story that I think if you want to get deep enough into Merton's studies, you need to contend with whether you accept the tone that he has in parts of the book, or I mean, there's certainly parts that are objectionable and you need to object to. Yeah, it's tricky in that sense, and I think I pretty early on had a James Martin esque kind of introduction to Merton in the sense that I think Seven Storey Mountain was my first contact, but I had watched the Wilkes film, and James Martin had watched the Wilkes film first, and then discovers the rest of Merton. But I knew the Seven Storey Mountain, and then I didn't know too much else about him, and then I had some interest in Merton, but I wasn't as interested in him. This is before coming to the Merton Center, that sort of thing. But then it was through the Wilkes film that I found that there was so many other sides to Merton, and that got me wanting to know more. So that was also what I wanted to convey with, yeah, I might recommend the Seven Storey Mountain, but in addition to other resources that help to give some background about where he's going from this place. I think that early seeking is really vital, and you don't quite get it anywhere else except Seven Storey Mountain and the journals, but it's very important.
Yeah, that's true. Second question, I don't think I've ever thought about this until you were talking tonight. I wondered, do you have any sense what the percentage would be between the Catholic readers and the non-Catholic readers, particularly in that first phase when it became the bestseller? And then I'm going to ask, obviously, follow-up question. Do you have any sense for today?
It's so hard to say. And, when I was rereading it, I did kind of wonder, well, did Merton himself think when he's writing this, some of the statements that he makes, well, for example, of course, all Protestant pastors hate Catholics. I mean, I think he says that about the pastor at Zion Church, Episcopal Church, where his parents went. He makes these really sweeping statements like that that can be objectionable. But I wonder if his thought was, well, this is going to be picked up by Catholic book clubs, and I'm talking to an inside audience. I mean, I would hope the more mature Merton would know better, or know, wouldn't have the instinct to say that in the first place. But maybe the younger Merton wasn't concerned that it was going to get to the ears of too many non-Catholics. But as far as who actually did get it, I'm not sure. That's a great question, and that would be interesting to research.
Yeah. Do you have any sense of the current readers that would pick it up? Are they people within the Catholic tradition, maybe practicing or otherwise, as opposed to maybe the I'm spiritual but not religious type?
Well,
I'm just interested in who's likely to find it attractive in our own world today.
Yeah, I think there is, the appeal is pretty broad, and there are, I don't know if there's as many folks who aren't Catholic reading it as Catholics, but it's pretty evenly split. And what I can say from within the Catholic world is that what you'll see on the more conservative side of the spectrum is either because of Merton's later writing, they don't want to recommend Merton at all. But then you have some who say, well, read The Seven-Storey Mountain. That's a good book to read. Maybe a few other early books, but you better stop there because Merton really went off the rails. And then you have people more progressive type Catholics who really do take serious umbrage at some of the things that he says in Seven-Storey Mountain. So they say, well, read anything but Seven-Storey Mountain. So there is this kind of split there. But there are those, I think, that kind of see the nuance and recognize it for what it is as an early work.
We got a comment from Kathy Bell. She's expressed her gratitude, as we all will. And then she says, I wonder whether one could even begin to understand such a complex individual if not given an opening into his life like we have there. And do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's why for me, I do place it as an important book, but just tricky that you have to provide some extra supplement to what's going on there. But yeah, I mean, it's a real window. And the other piece of it is that of the manuscripts that survived, the Boston College and Columbia manuscripts, we think we know of earlier parts of it that were cut out. And that would just be the real treasure trove to find in probably a publisher's archive, if it exists, and if it's in a publisher's archive, an earlier draft with some of the things that were cut out for monastic censors, maybe some things that he didn't think should be in there. I mean, it's a long book, and it kind of it needed even maybe more editing than it had. You can see behind me the British version that Yves Lenoir edited. That's a slimmer volume, and I've not read Elected Silence beginning to end. Paul Pearson tells me he has not read Seven-Storey Mountain beginning to end because he read Elected Silence, and so yeah, I would love to see some of those parts. There was a piece that of Seven-Storey Mountain that was on the verso of another manuscript that we found in the collection that seemed to clearly come out of Seven-Storey Mountain, was cut off, and Merton was using a scrap paper, but it doesn't exist in any other kind of manuscripts anywhere else. And even the parts from the two manuscripts that we know about that have been cut out are interesting. And there was some graduate work done years ago by Andrea Newhoff. Her undergraduate and master's work theses are in the Thomas Merton Center, and they've been very useful to me in trying to kind of piece together some of the editing process, but it's only partial what we have. We don't have the full story of what was cut out of Seven-Storey Mountain. The other place that people look to for autobiographical material that may have been in Seven Story Mountain and got cut out or just not included was Merton's early novel attempts at novels. The characters, the protagonists of which seem to be thinly veiled autobiographical references throughout. So, you know, there's this kind of well-known part of one of them where Merton participates in this, or the character. I'm sorry, I'm making the connection. The character in the story participates in a mock crucifixion, and Merton relates on his passport or some kind of entry documents into the United States that he has a scar on the palm of one of his hands. So, you know, was that something that he felt really guilty about and didn't feel it would be too scandalous to say something that happened in his days at Cambridge.
Yeah. Cool.
Interesting to conjecture whether that happened or not.
Yeah. Do you want to say any more about all their background there, which is pretty graphic? We can see all the books. Is there more to be shared by that? And
you know, I have a link at the top of the chat where you can find the covers of all the various translations that we have copies of at the center, and I tried to capture various U.S. and foreign editions of the book. You can see the cover, some of the first pages of the books as well on the exhibit site, so you can browse it somewhat like a bookshelf.
Cool, thank you for that. Our own Paul Pinkowski has this to share with you, Mark. Seven Story Mountain inspired vocations. Later books seem to provoke contemplative reflection and then reflection on social issues. Do you see any sort of connecting thread?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether the change was the change in the writings or the change in those who were becoming attracted to religious life. I think that's somewhat hard to suss out. You know, a couple of the most recent novices that came to Gethsemane did reference Thomas Merton. I'm not sure if it was Seven Story Mountain or other works of his, but reference Merton as being influential in their decision to become monks. But I think it's much less of a phenomenon now, Merton generating religious vocations to the religious life, to the vowed religious life, but certainly the interest in lay contemplative life has continued, but also, as you're saying, prompted people to social action, but also the Mertonian style of being very contemplative about having a contemplative critique of activism and social action as well. You know, you see that so well documented in Gordon Oyer's book that I referenced, The Pursuing the Spiritual Roots of Protest. He really documents that well, how you know, Merton's role was not to be in the streets, to be on the front lines of protest, but he did provide some good challenge and asked peacemakers, Protestant and Catholic, to consider, you know, what are their, you know, by what right do they protest?
Yeah, good. As I was listening to you, I think you see more continuity between Seven Story Mountain and the later Merton than I probably do. Can you say more about the continuity that you see?
Yeah, I mean, I still see Merton as having this attitude of cultural criticism of especially American culture. And you see him connect with writers like Henry Miller, you know, he's writing Air Conditioned Nightmare, that sort of thing. So that level of criticism continues. It's just how he's responding and reacting and relating back to the world, forging a connection back to it. But it's not as if he thought things were a lot duckier, as he an adjective he used to describe the Teilhardian view of the world, that the world is all ducky. And you know, he's getting more sensitive to different sorts of problems as he's starting to understand what's happening with the nuclear arms race, as he has more of a critical appreciation of the evils of racism, indigenous rights, after reading Rachel Carson, environmental justice. So he's actually picking up more grievances as he's going along in the years. But at the same time, it's not a, hey, let's get angrier and shout louder. As he says in Faith and Violence, it shouldn't be a warring of symbols. We need to get back to a root of communication, person to person, on these issues. And when we, you know, turn the various sides and make the issue the face of it, we're going to miss connecting with the person who disagrees with us.
Yeah. And the last question I'll have, and then after you answer that, Teresa can pick it up. I'm interested in, the book's been around for 75 years now, and you haven't been around quite that long, but has Seven Storey Mountain changed for you as you've lived now 20 years at the center, and then maybe a few years before that when you read it? So has the book itself changed for you over the years as you perhaps changed? You certainly have grown and matured.
I felt closer to the youthful struggles that Merton had of trying to make sense of the world, make sense of faith and that sort of thing when I first read it. But now, yeah, it's all the rereading, a lot of things jump out. I think for two reasons. One, because I've changed, and I can see things from more of the adult perspective when he's a young adult and he's acting out, and the adults in his life are trying to correct him. Having a child myself, it gives you a different perspective on that sort of thing. So yeah, that's one way that has changed. But the other way is just that I've spent enough time at the center, mainly helping other people with their research projects. I'm learning about all these different aspects of Merton that I didn't understand when I first read Seven Storey Mountain. So I have so much more knowledge and context of all the different things that he's writing about, and then also where this is going to go, where it's going to lead. And I wouldn't have been able to identify, for example, what you'd mentioned, Alan, about there being this connective perspective, what was the same and what was different in his later writings when I first encountered Seven Storey Mountain. So that's definitely changed in my rereading of it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
All right. Well, Mark, thank you so very much. What a wonderful topic to begin our fourth season with. And I've been sitting here thinking, if you hadn't thought of it, we would have probably had to commission a talk about the 75th anniversary of the publication of the Seven Storey Mountain. So thank you so much for all that you brought to that for us. I also want to thank Dr. Julia Feder, who was named earlier. Julia is Assistant Director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality at St. Mary's, and she's been providing the technical support for this evening's Tuesday with Merton in the absence of Dan Horan, who had a conflict tonight. Alan, thank you for, again, so skillfully moderating the questions. In the future, if you'd like to tell your friends about this presentation or some others on Tuesday with Merton, we have Bob Grip to thank for posting the webinars on YouTube, and Mark Meade himself making them available for us as podcasts. You can find links to the recordings of previous webinars at merton.org/ITMS. Registration is now open for next month's webinar, when filmmaker Cassidy Hall will speak to us on queering Thomas Merton. I also want to mention a very special event that you won't want to miss. The very first annual Fourth and Walnut Lecture featuring Ilia Delio, who will be speaking on Merton's Christophany and the Second Axial Monk. The event will take place on Tuesday, November 14th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on the campus of St. Mary's College, and it will also be live streamed. For more information, you can go to the website of either one of our co-sponsors, the Center for the Study of Spirituality at St. Mary's College, or the International Thomas Merton Society. Thank you for joining us today and for continuing to spread the good word about Tuesdays with Merton. So for now, goodbye, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you next month.